like this week is just not a good start.
How'd it go?
It actually went really well. I thought I missed like a bunch and I got like a 98. So
oh, nice.
Yeah.
Worked out.
Worked out pretty well.
How's it going?
Good. How about you?
Pretty good. Oh, there's some cool. I didn't know you could blur the background in here.
How do you do that?
I don't know if it works. Yeah, I think it works.
That's cool.
Panic 2 times.
Whenever this meeting's done, we should hang on to this recording so we can send it out to some professors and such. I think Mandy might be interested in it.
I have no clue what you just said.
Oh, never mind. Not important.
What am I doing?
Does anyone have plans for this summer?
Nothing other than just working a lot. What about you?
I'm trying to get an internship, but it's not out for me.
Nice.
Kira?
I'm working front desk at a DoubleTree.
Oh, nice.
So that should be interesting.
It's pretty sweet.
Is it just mine, or is Microsoft always glitching? This platform's always glitching out for me.
It seems to be doing
Yeah.
fine, but I don't know.
Huh.
What do you mean by glitching? Just like people keep cutting in and out?
Yeah.
Not sure why that is.
I'm so bad at technology.
Me too. I opened a window and I don't know how to get rid of it.
Who else do we have in here? Is that Andrew? Andrew, and is that Anthony?
Yeah, I'm in here. I didn't see Anthony yet.
I see another A.
Ashley.
Ryan. Oh, that's Ashley.
Ashley's in here, yeah.
She's just chilling here the whole time.
Yeah, she's been in here.
She's out with her parents right now at a restaurant, actually. So, but I think she has to be in here to host it. I might text her to see if she can transfer the host over to somebody else.
That's what I was thinking earlier. That's why I was like, is she able to switch that job to someone?
I hope our guest speaker isn't like waiting in the lobby or something.
Does she have to let them in?
Yeah.
Yep.
Only her, because everyone else had a link or?
No, she had to let everybody in. But I was to see if you could transfer it.
Oh, anyone can.
Oh, there we go. All right, there we go.
I think we got it. Work out?
Here.
Hello?
See, hi.
Hi,
Hello.
Denise.
Hello.
I'm a Ken that's been contacting.
You've been talking to me. Yes, nice to meet you.
Yes.
Okay.
So I don't know. Should start right away, or should we wait for anybody?
You can wait a
You think
couple
we're
minutes. I
gonna-
have a couple of things that I wanted to put in the chat titles. So I can get those and give me like 3 minutes and I can get those in the chat for you. Okay? All right.
Hey, that sounds.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, you don't have to let him in.
There's Anthony.
You're the worst.
He's always late.
6 o'clock.
I got
It's
6:01 by global clock.
Well, I sat in the waiting room for like at least 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's Ashley's fault.
Most likely. When in doubt, blame Ashley.
Sounds like you're cooking.
I am. Excuse me.
What you cooking?
Just a skillet full of stuff. Nothing. There's no cohesion or no plan. It's a bunch of vegetables and some sauce and some shrimp, and that's it.
Would you get that off Rachel Ray?
Yeah, it's exactly where I
Recipe?
got it. Yeah, I did. Also, the Good Housekeeping Cookbook. I keep that one around. Those recipes circa 1954 are pretty outstanding. Like the Vienna sausage Jello mold is my go-to.
Even on your new diet?
Yeah, love it. Yeah, that's my cheat day.
Oh,
Do you guys even know what Vienna sausages are? Like the little sausages in a can. Have you ever seen the recipes I'm talking about from the 50s where they Jello molded everything?
Terrifying.
Pretty amazing.
Horrifying.
It is horrifying. That's absolutely correct.
I don't think we're gonna get any more people.
Hey, we got some people.
We got people. Our normal
Okay,
people.
he's in the chat. And okay, so the first one is a link to the Cherokee legend. Let's see, it didn't work. Oh, yes, it did.
I'm not seeing anything
So
in the
the
chat.
legend of the
Oh, there we
strawberries.
go.
Okay, and then I have a list of texts that I will put in here. Let me make sure I got them all situated. Last one.
While she's doing that, I don't know who all knows her, our guest speaker, but this is Denise Harrison. She
Okay.
is a professor of English in the Department of Pan-African Studies, which I didn't know existed until Mandy connected me with her. It's a social activist program that integrates social, racial, gender, and class divisions with an eye on representation and history of people of African I don't know if I said that right.
Diaspora. The
Yeah.
diaspora. Mhm.
She's also a quilt artist, which I thought was very interesting. And she focuses on examining cultural food as a lens of which to examine the politics of race, class, gender, and sexual minorities in American society.
Mhm.
So if you want to explain a little bit more about all that and introduce yourself and then take it away.
Sure. So I teach in the English department. So I'm a professor in English. My classes are in the Department of Pan-African Studies, which is going to be, we're changing our name to the Department of Africana Studies to be more inclusive. Our department teaches from a social activist point of view. So in other words, along with choosing text that centers on the Africans from the African diaspora, which means all of those Africans who were pushed all over the world through the institution of slavery. Those are diasporic Africans. The term diaspora comes from the Jewish community when you think about the 12 tribes that are scattered. So that term does not originate with the African people or African Americans. It really originates with the Jewish community. And so I like to be really specific about that. First, to show that it didn't come from us. And secondly, to understand that there are many people who have been scattered throughout the world, not by choice, but often by force. And so we are in alliance with people who have been removed from their homelands, removed from their territories. And so when I use that term, I like to explain that. The other thing is I teach about food as a way to teach about race, class, gender, sexual minorities. And I start with Africans who were forcibly removed from their homeland for their skilled labor. And the fact that in America, we have 3,000 plus foods that are contributed to those Africans who were forcibly removed from the western coast of Africa, primarily all the way up through South America. And in fact, the United States had less of those folks who were forcibly removed. Most of the Africans who were forcibly transported ended up in South America. So anywhere from Mexico through up to Brazil is where most people ended up being, throughout the Caribbean, of course, as well. So there's an understanding when I'm talking about diaspora, there is a widespread of folks. And then through wars and other things, as we get into the modern era, and then the postmodern era, we'll see people are trafficked by three things. Climate change is one. Totalitarian or authoritarian governments are another. And then war in their homeland. So those three reasons in the contemporary world are why we are seeing 1 billion people move about the face of the earth at this current moment. The second group of people that I teach about is indigenous populations. And you'll hear me say Aboriginal, First Nation, indigenous, original people. And I tend to say all of them in the same way that currently we talk about, a little bit more, please, thanks. In the same way we talk about BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. I like to get away from that and name each individual group of people. So you'll hear me talk about Black people, Indigenous, Latinx. If I'm talking about people in the Latin community who are women, I will say Latina. If I'm talking about people in the community who are males, I would say Latino, Asian, Asian American, and Pacific Islanders. And that's a lot. I understand that that's a lot to say, but we're talking about giving people back their humanity. And I think it's really important to name folks. And so you will hear me say that as I talk through what I prepared today. Okay, And then the second thing is, in teaching about indigenous peoples, they were our first horticulturists. So Aboriginal, First Nation, indigenous people, when we talk about things like organic farming, it is their farming techniques that we're taking. They created corn. They created corn by grafting grasses together until they produced corn. And most of that corn that was produced came from around the Mexican-American border, our southern border. That pocket of indigenous Mexicans actually created corn. They are the cousins to the indigenous people that reside in what we call Arizona, the Kickapoo Nation and the Hopi Nation are the cousins of those people. And so we saw that corn spread throughout the Americas and in North America. And so I talk about that. I talk about the idea of the three sisters. That's corn, squash, and beans. Indigenous communities, especially in the northeastern seaboard of the United States, these were staples. They would plant the corn and the beans that would be vine beans that would grow up the stalks of the corn. And then they'd plant the squash on the bottom so that it kept the ground moist. And those three things worked well together nutritionally, but also in terms of planting three things together that really cemented a diet for the community. The food that they would eat has always been regional because you farmed, fished, and hunted in your territories. And so, and I'll talk about this in a minute. So, for example, they didn't eat chickens because they didn't breed chickens. They didn't eat cows because they didn't have cows. And so they had all kinds of different fowl. They would have beaver. They would have all kinds of other animals, but no beef, chicken, or pigs, which is what the American diet ends up being. Those things will come into their diet at a later period after the migration of forceful migration of indigenous Aboriginal First Nations people, because what they will eat will be instituted by the United States government under treaty. So when we write a treaty with someone, and we have many of them, we're going to say we're going to take care of you, we're going to house you, we're going to educate you, and we're going to provide food for you. That food that is provided does not look like the food that they would have had access to. So if we take the Pequots, for example, who occupied the territory that we would call Connecticut, Mystic Lake, that area, Hyannisport, that's the Pequot territory. When we signed a treaty with the Pequots, it was called the Hartford Treaty or the Treaty of Hartford. The Pequots literally had to sign away their name and their identity. They could no longer call themselves Pequots. So say you're in this particular part of the country, as far up as Massachusetts, for example, and cranberry is a staple in your diet. And when the cranberry harvest comes along, you would have had a festival celebrating the cranberry. Cranberries would be a fertility fruit, right? So when the cranberries bloom, we think about the fertileness of the land, of the soil, of the people. And you would have many celebrations, and you will make special dishes surrounding that food. What happened is that as they were signed a treaty and are forcefully migrated off their land, no access to cranberries. So everything connected with cranberries, including the word that you used to name it, it's no longer yours. You cannot call yourself Pequots. And so by teaching about that particular treaty and other treaties by Aboriginals, First Nation, Indigenous people that we sign with them, we have to understand when we look at those signatures for Indigenous peoples, most of those are X's. And yet in the Americas, where we are colonized, where we have a colonial entity, the first people who are writing in English that are not English people are Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous people. Because when we colonize, we're also going to Christianize. And when we Christianize, we're going to teach you to read and write in English so that you can read the Bible. And some Bibles would have been translated. There's a famous scholar by the name of, she's Wapagoan. Her name is Jessie Little Doe Baird. Jessie Little Doe Baird has, over the last 20 years, reclaimed the Wapangoan language to the point that she's created a dictionary. She interviewed people in the nation who were still living, who spoke part of the language. She went through treaties and all kinds of hundreds of documents that the colonial entities wrote with Indigenous people, including some Bibles, and was able to recover the language. A project that she ended up getting a MacArthur grant for. And so in recovering the language, you find out that Indigenous people don't have words for certain things. Winona LaDuke, another Indigenous Aboriginal woman from the Anishinaabe people in Minnesota on White Earth Reservation, worked with environmental issues. And one of the things she found out was there was no word for nuclear waste in their nation's tongue. So if they had wastewater that was contaminated from drilling, they didn't have a word to explain to the government that their water was contaminated because there was no word in the language. There are other nations in which there is no word for I, me, or mine. And so when we start to look at that, we can see how the cultures are different and diverse. But if I get back to food and regional cooking, so one of the things that I did today is I prepared an Indigenous meal for my family for dinner. So one of the things they would have had is wild rice. Wild rice is not the wild rice that we get in our grocery stores, even if it says organic, natural, wild rice, because Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous wild rice grows in lakes. How many of you have had wild rice from a lake? Okay, so you have, so on Winona LaDuke's reservation, White Earth in Minnesota, they still harvest the rice the way they've always did it. What they tell us is that as a people migrating, they were told by the Creator to go where where food grows on the water. And they ended up in the lakes in Minnesota. And guess what's growing there? Wild rice. And today they harvest it the exact same way they harvested centuries ago. So in the fall, after the rice is grown, they get in a canoe, they beat the plants with sticks, with bags inside of their canoes, and the rice falls in there. And then they clean the rice out, parch it, bag it, and they sell it. This is the only place I buy my wild rice. It's a little expensive to ship because it's heavy, but I don't care. It's worth it to pay people a reasonable wage for the work that they do in harvesting this wild rice. Number two, because the men and women who collect the wild rice can make up to from $200 to $400 a day harvesting. That's a substantial amount of money for an Indigenous person, Aboriginal, First Nations person in this culture today. So they can not only sustain their families, but they also sustain a way of life. They call the rice monoman. And so their name, so again, connect it back to their culture because they're using the language that they've always had, the language that's theirs, not a language that was given to them. So Again, the food is regional. It is connected to where you live. One of the other things I talk about when I talk about Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations cultures is that the idea of Thanksgiving in a European sense, in an American traditional sense, is about a turkey, being thankful that we're all coming together, all of that narrative that we watch when we see commercials telling us Thanksgiving is coming and be with your family and etc. For Aboriginal First Nations peoples, that's a day of mourning. It's a day of grieving because for them, their Thanksgiving was that over 300 of them were put in a cabin and poisoned, and they died. And the next day, the settlers celebrate their conquest of these people. And so it's men, women, and children who died. So for their cultural community, that is not a day of celebration. So about 10 years ago, as a way to be in solidarity with the people, I stopped doing a traditional Thanksgiving. Now, every now and then, I go to somebody's house out of an invitation and I may partake in that. I try to avoid it, but if I can't, I can't. But for my family, I prepare a meal based on indigenous foodways, which means I have to go to the store and I have to buy the right things, like blue corn. I have to have my wild rice, cranberries, pumpkin seeds, pine nuts, all the things, all the ingredients, but also the seasonings, the sage, the sumac, the juniper seeds. I have to have all those things to cook a traditional indigenous meal. So I have to do my homework. I have collected cookbooks that are written by indigenous chefs and people who know the food ways of the communities. And so those are the only ones that I use. I try not to modify the recipes if I can. Duck eggs over chicken eggs, if I can find them. They're not always easy to find. But I do not use the sugar, white sugar, use maple syrup because they harvested syrup. Berries for sweetener. So one of the other things that we'll have for dinner tonight is a pitcher of strawberry water, and where you take the strawberries, you crush them, you put maple in them, maple sap in them, or some other, or honey, excuse me, rather than white sugar. And you smash that together, and then you put that in the refrigerator and let it sit and cool. And that's one of the drinks. That's not the kind of sugary feel drinks that would be available to you if you lived on the reservation at the corner store that sits right outside the reservation, where Europeans have put a store there. And one of the things, and put in a store just on the border of the reservation, on the reservation, you can't sell alcohol, but you can certainly sell alcohol outside the reservation. And systematically, in almost every reservation community, there is a store that's selling alcohol. That's to the detriment of the people. One of the reasons we believe that they're more susceptible to alcoholism is genetically susceptible, but also in terms of their physiology, that they have bigger hearts, blood pump faster, you get drunk faster. And so you have this history of, on a reservation, 80% unemployment, 80% suicide rates, 80% alcoholism, the highest rate of domestic violence. And then when we talk about targeted rapes, Indigenous women are targeted as victims of rape more than any other cultural community. So imagine that one of the things the reservation offers you is a connection to your people, but look at the other things that it offers you. And then if you get off the reservation and you're urban indigenous aboriginal person, sometimes people are forced to change their names even today to not be associated with our idea of what it means to be indigenous. Because in our media, in our videos, most of the time indigenous people are still stuck in the 18th century and the 19th century. And so we don't think of people as being modern people. And yet there are modern American, Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations people. So all of those things are part and parcel of what it means to be Indigenous. Plus you're dealing with a Holocaust that has gone unacknowledged. When I go to conferences where Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations people are the subjects, there is a lot of pain in the room, and you have to come to terms with that. It is not an easy place to be. One of the things that I try and do is to understand as an African American person what that pain must feel like, what that weight must feel like. Whenever I've gone to these conferences, the food that is served is always from an indigenous kitchen. And so bison stew, there's a grape. It's kind of like a pie, but you use grapes instead of cherries to make the pie. And other things, all kinds of stews, all kinds of green salads, a lot of watercress in the salads, dandelions and other wild, what we would call weeds. In indigenous community where the knowledge is intact and this is growing, people know how to go to the forest, go into their backyards and harvest things that we who don't know call weeds because they're edible plants growing all around us. One of the assignments that I give my students in class over a weekend is to just go look around their backyards and find what the edible plants are. And they're always amazed that they're actually there. Sean Sherman, who's written and probably right now one of the most critical indigenous persons talking about native foodways, because he started a trend that was starting already, but he codified it by writing a cookbook that won the James Beard Award. It's called The Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen. And I use that as a text in my class. It has recipes, but it also has history. It shows the students what certain kinds of beans look like. One of the things we find today is our students don't know food outside of they've never seen the stem of a carrot. That's the best example. We have students that don't know that carrots have stems on them, that the root is what you're eating. They just have no idea, never seen that. At the Food Institute in Cleveland, they had a project where they were bringing fourth graders to talk about food and help with the garden, etc. And they found that the only carrots that they knew of was the little short carrots that came in a bag. And so they realized they had to start younger at educating kids about food. Sean Sherman did this by first educating himself and then taking his education out to the community and talking about indigenous foodways, not just his cultural community, but when he went to another cultural community, he would investigate that cultural community, and then he would put on a talk about the food and prepare the food as well. And it was a way to bring the community back to their traditions. And then the older people in the community would all of a sudden start to share their stories and share their cultural knowledge. And what I've learned over the years is that is not unlike any of us. My students who are Italian, if I ask them, they will talk about those Sunday meals at their grandmother's house and how the sauce is made by this person, the pasta made by that person, and how everybody is talking on 10 and they get around the table. And they are only 2 or 3 generations out from Sicily or Italy, whatever town that they come from, their family come from, and they eat these foods. And they do this often with not a lot of knowledge about the backstory. Why did you come to the United States? And one of the things they find out is the very same reason: fleeing totalitarian governments, climate change, or the fact that you went through a drought. If you're Irish, your family went through 3 droughts and there was no work, and you're dealing with a government of Britain that has its foot on your neck, and the only chance you have to make it is to flee and come to the United States. What do you do when you get here? You set up shops. Not only do you set up shops, you also have a store where you can buy the food that you had at home. That becomes central. And so if I'm talking about indigenous foodways, Aboriginal First Nations foodways, if I'm talking about the foods that Africans brought with them, and the fact that those Africans end up being the cooks for our planter class, that the food we will inherit that we will call low country cooking is cooking by Africans. That something like barbecue that African Americans seem to embrace as that's our food, it is not. That barbecue is from indigenous Aboriginal people. Soul food, the term soul food did not come until the 60s, when the Black Panthers were feeding children breakfasts. We now have breakfast programs in schools. It was the Black Panthers that did that. Food banks, they created food banks. Our federal government supports food banks. But at the time that they were doing these things, they ended up as targets for the FBI and other intelligence organizations because A, they were feeding their community, B, they were educating their community about the history of Africa and African Americans in America. And so they became part of, there's something going on here that's suspicious. Indigenous Aboriginal folks, the same thing. When Sean Chef's first book first arrived, there were people who thought, what is this about? After he won the James Beard Award for the book, a year and a half later, he won the James Beard Award for leadership. And now we have a number of young Indigenous Aboriginal chefs all over the country going back to their food ways. Sean Sherman says, Indigenous food ways are what the paleo diet wants to be. He says it's what it wants to be. And so when you are eating clean, whole food, one of the other things that you notice about the way their food ways is that there's work in the food ways, in terms of if it's corn, to create that corn into meal. If you're making cornbread, there's a process, because you're not buying it in a box from a corporation that made it for you, putting all kinds of additives in it. And so the more we get to thinking about indigenous food ways and how natural they are, how that there is some work to preparing these foods, it gets us back into our kitchen. And when we get back into our kitchen, we typically eat healthier. When we're calling somebody to deliver food to us, or if we're driving to a fast food restaurant, or if we're opening a box and dumping it in and pouring some water on it or milk on it, that is not a healthy way of eating. And so one of the other things that I try to teach is for African American and other students of color, Indigenous Aboriginal folks, Latinx folks, that a lot of what we're eating and have access to is really unhealthy for us. And so when I talk about those 2 points of history, Aboriginal, First Nation, Indigenous ways of food ways, And then I talk about the Africans who brought over 3,000 foods with them as they were forcefully migrated for their labor. We move into the period where Africans are preparing the food for most of this, or at least the Southern economy. They are the preparers of the food. And when we think about that, we think about the kind of food that they prepared, and we start to understand a history of civil rights. Frederick Douglass Opie wrote a book called Southern Foodways, Feeding the Revolution. And what he does is he tracks the civil rights movement through food. What students come to understand with the recipes in that book is the recipes have 4 or 5 or 6 ingredients. Michael Palin in 2000 said, don't eat something that has more than 5 ingredients or 6 ingredients in it. When we look at the foodways of African Americans during the civil rights movement, 5 ingredients in a recipe. What we see after the World War II, the commercialization of our food, the food industry is going to tell you that they can make pudding for you faster and better, and you're going to have all this time, because they're speaking to moms who are now have matriculated into the workplace during the war, and they're going to tell you they can make this pudding better and faster, and you're going to have time to sit down because in 5 minutes your family can have dessert. Well, their pudding has like 30 items in it. Some of them you can't pronounce. When I make pudding for my family, it's 5 ingredients. It's chocolate, sugar, it's corn syrup, it's milk, and a little salt, vanilla flavor, and I make my own of that. So I know exactly what's in the food. It takes 20 minutes. And what we have to convince students of, 20 minutes is not a long time to create a dessert that you made. 20 minutes is ready. So if you want hot pudding, it's ready in 20 minutes. If you want cold pudding, you can make it in the morning, put it in your refrigerator. And when you come home from school or from work, you have it in the evening as a dessert, a cold dessert. So those are the kinds of things that by teaching about food and food ways of indigenous, aboriginal, First Nations folks and Africans and African Americans, that I can inform students of. How do I talk about sexual minorities in all of this? Because in part, one of the things I want students to understand is that food is central to who we are. For our LGBTQ plus students and siblings, once they identify and name themselves, and especially when kids come to college, they are free to be themselves. They go back home and they tell their parents who they are, and they get kicked out. Pan-African Studies has a pantry when we are physically located back on campus. And in our food pantry that we created, one of the things we find, and the Women's Center has also found this, that we have many college students that cannot sustain themselves. And so the Women's Center has a food pantry. Pan-African Studies, our food pantry is made of gift cards. And the way we do it is after learning about food for a while and having my students do food drives. One semester, I had 95 cans of carrots. And I said, how many of you eat, in every class, I said, how many of you eat canned carrots? Nobody. And I had to ask them, why are we collecting something we won't eat? That doesn't seem right to me. So what we started doing is getting food cards, because by this point, we'd understand the problems of the Western diet. We understood that some of our students were vegetarians, some were vegan, some had issues with diabetes, and some of the canned products that students were donating were just not good for them. What if we gave them a gift card to a local grocery store for $20 or $30 and let them go buy some food? And then our students who are hungry, who are vegan, don't have to have the beans with the pork in them. Our students who are on restricted diets because of salt don't have to have cans of soups with high salt content, because mostly students were not collecting canned food that was organic. They weren't collecting canned food that was low in sodium. They were collecting things that were high in sugar, fat, and salt. And so we wanted to do something different. And when we come back to campus, we'll start our pantry again. But our pantry was based on that. We had 2 young men who were removed from their dorm because they got in a fight with their roommate. And these young men were gay. And they had nowhere to go. And I said to my colleague who mentioned that they had been tossed out of the dorm, I said, they're going to need something to eat. Have them come over. And at this time, we had food on shelves. I said, we have bags, and I want them to go in and make sure that they have enough food to get them through the next few days until we can get them situated with housing. And they were embarrassed that they had to do that. And I told them this is what it was for. But in terms of those 2 young men and other students felt conspicuous if they were walking across campus with bags of canned goods. So for that's the second reason that we stopped collecting the canned goods. It's different, I think, if you can drive up to the pantry over in the Women's Center and they've already bagged it and you load them in your car. But in between classes, carrying a bunch of cans, students really felt conspicuous. So I just stopped doing that. I should stop and let you ask me some questions.
I know I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
I don't know about anybody else. I'll ask one of mine and then see if they've got any questions. My first question is, what is blue corn? Because I have literally never heard of that.
Okay, so corn comes in different colors, right? You've seen the stalks of corn that are red, you've seen them blue, you've seen the blue corn chips. That's from a particular variety of corn. And so the corn for my cornbread today came from blue cornmeal, and then it had some yellow cornmeal. And then sometimes I will also put whole kernel corn in that. So it becomes a 3-corn muffin. It would be seasoned with maple syrup, no sugar. And you get the maple syrup it's really sweet. So you really get a lot of sweetness, and raisins. And so those are your 2 sweeteners, raisins and maple syrup. So you can have a 3-corn muffin with raisins in it, and it's delicious. And so it's those kinds of things. And we don't think about that because, again, it's about what food are we exposed to. When I send students to their stores to see what's there, before they go, they don't understand that there are over 3,000 varieties of potatoes, and potatoes are not from Ireland. Potatoes are from South America, and that they have all kinds of textures and colors. And just to get them to try something different, my husband is from upstate New York. Lots of Irish ended up in upstate New York when the United States closed the borders to the Irish coming in through Ellis Island. And so we this is how I teach. So we talk about immigration today, but when we started to really unpack immigration, there was a time we told the Irish, no more, we're not taking any more of you folks. So what they would do is they would go to Canada and then migrate from Canada into the United States. That's how my husband's family came here. And until I did some research on his family, we didn't know the track. We just assumed they came through Ellis Island. No, because we had policies to end that immigration through Ellis Island. So now I can talk about potatoes because I'm talking about a potato famine because of a monocrop. So when you have one variety of potatoes and they get infected with a disease, it's going to wipe them all out. That's the same thing we have when we think about all the potatoes that all the restaurants are selling, the russet potato, right? If there is a potato blight with the russet potato, we're going to be in trouble in this country because that's by and large, that potato is servicing the food industry. So that becomes a problem. And so now I could talk about monocrops, why it's important to have variety in the crops, just in the same way that indigenous folks knew that it was important to have a variety of corn. And not only did they have this variety of corn, but they would harvest the corn and save seeds. So if you want to find heirloom seeds in this country, go to indigenous communities. They have them because they've always been seed savers. Is not something new. Today, we're talking about seed saving. There's a young man in San Francisco that started producing heirloom beans. And he sells a little bag of beans online for like $10 because he collected people's beans and now he's selling it. But indigenous people have been doing this all along. And so we want heirloom beans. Our local library in Akron, you can go there and get 6 different seeds at a time because they have a collection of heirloom seeds there. And they just give them to you and you take them and you can grow a little garden in your backyard and a raised garden. So that kind of thing to get people to understand that you don't need a lot of space. What is her name? Buffalo Bird Woman. There was this young man who did his dissertation on indigenous foodways, and he took this woman's diaries of indigenous foodways, and that was his dissertation. So when you go to buy it, it has his name on it, but the book is by Buffalo Bird Woman. And she shows you how indigenous people planted. So we have those artifacts. We have those histories. This summer, I'm going to plant a raised garden using her way of planting to get more in tune with that way of thinking that the earth, Mother Earth, has given us everything we need. This is, I think, for me, this is one of the most significant things about teaching about indigenous foodways and indigenous culture. Imagine how you would treat the earth if the earth was your mother. I mean, literally your mother. And the 4-legged and the 2-legged and those with fur and those with feathers and those with fins are your sisters and brothers. You're treated very differently. So let me tell you one story about what that means. In the Haudenosaunee Nation, which is part of this Confederacy of the Six Nations, 4 years ago, they started a farmer's market. And so they planted corn and other crops. And the first year, they got this tremendous yield. The second year, they didn't get so much because it rained all summer. So the corn was wet. They only had like 24 hours to harvest and dry and sort and dry the corn. Okay. The third year, the raccoons kept getting into the corn. Now, what do we do when the raccoons get in the corn? We put traps out for the raccoons. We put pesticides on the corn. Maybe that'll hurt the raccoons and they won't eat it. Do you know what they did? They said, those are our brothers. They planted corn for the raccoons. So the raccoons had their corn and they had their corn. Can you imagine what kind of a world we would have if we had just taken some of the ways of indigenous, aboriginal, First Nations people? Not all of them, but if we had just taken some of their ways that we are supposed to deal in reciprocity and gratitude. Mother Earth has given us everything we need on Turtle Island to sustain ourselves, and they call the Earth Turtle Island. And there's a beautiful story about Sky Woman. If you want to hear a beautiful creation story, you don't have to get rid of Adam and Eve. But if you want to hear another creation story, read the story about Sky Woman. And the best version I've heard or gotten is by Joanne Shenandoah. She's Haudenosaunee. She's written a book on Sky Woman. And when you read that story and you understand how this culture operates, how people who have been at war with one another came together and said, okay, we're not only are we going to quit fighting each other, because this is another one of their stories, we're going to bury all of our weapons. And when they buried their weapons in the Haudenosaunee Nation, the great tree grew, the great tree of peace. And everything that you see from them has this emblem of the great tree of peace. They still have a wampum belt that they read, the history of their people. Our Constitution comes from them. We only take a little bit because in their culture, it's matrilineal. Women matter. In the Haudenosaunee Nation, you take the surname of your mother. You belong to your mother's clan, not your father's clan. And if you join with a woman, you join into her clan, not yours. She doesn't take yours. The two-spirited persons, when we talk about our LGBTQ plus siblings, most indigenous cultural communities always believe that there are people with more than one spirit. And that spirit is male and female and something else. And that was not a problem. And so now we're seeing more scholarship on this, but that was just the way they were as a people, right? So there's a lot that we can learn from their ways about acceptance, about peace, about resilience. I think one of the most remarkable things is just the fact that they are a resilient community of peoples, that they keep going and they insist that they not only have we been here, but we're going to remain here. They think in terms of, we say our grandchildren, they say 7 generations, our children's 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 children. That's who they work for. So now imagine we have politicians and they're telling us about taxes and they're saying we don't want to add to the deficit because what about my grandkids? We don't want to think about climate change, our grandkids, any issue you want to think about your grandchildren. Now take that to 7 generations. How would you think about climate change if you're thinking in terms of 7 generations? These are the people that NASA meet with every year and says, what is the earth looking like? How can NASA ask Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations people what the earth look like? Because they come from a oral tradition and they can tell you. In Sri Lanka, 15 years ago, when there was a tsunami, Indigenous people in Sri Lanka did not suffer the tsunami. Why? Because they were told that when the animals do this certain thing, when the sky looks a certain way, when the sea does this, you are to go to higher ground. And they survived because they had that oral tradition and history of stories that they had shared. And there were some people in various tribes in Sri Lanka that didn't have the effects of the tsunami because they read the signs. So that's what Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations people can teach us. They can teach us through their foodways. They can teach us through their relationship with Mother Earth. They can teach us through their relationships with each other, how they've had to, where if I was a Pequot, and the Pequot signed this treaty, not only lost your land and your language and your culture, but your identity, then maybe I join the Wapagoans. I can't call myself a Pequot. By the time we have something called the Department of Interior, within it, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in order for me to be a Pequot again, I got to prove myself. I got to prove my language. I got to prove my territory. I got to prove a history. Now, that first treaty said I can't do this. I don't exist anymore. And do you all know that today the United States government denies people tribal affiliation because they can't prove themselves? That's the world we live in. And so when I teach this, I want students to start to think about not equal, equitable. What's an equitable thing for us to do? So one of the equitable things for us to do this year with the change in administration is, for the first time in the history of the United States, make an Indigenous woman the head of the Department of Interior, because within the Department of Interior, there are 6 organizations that deal specifically with Indigenous people. Not just the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but think about, of all of our parks and recreation in this country, places we call national park, guess what those are? That's Indian country. It's their territory. And the reason we have it is because we said we're going to be good stewards of it. And as long as we're good stewards of it, it's not supposed to go back to them. But if we're allowing drilling on this land, is that being a good steward? So those are the kinds of things I can teach when I start saying, let's look at Indigenous Aboriginal foodways. Let's look at where people are located. Let's look at how Africans were forcefully migrated for their labor. Let's look at their foodways when they came from West Africa. What kind of foodways did they bring with us? And where do we see those foodways today? And now let's look at your families coming from Europe, because nobody was here before the Indigenous people. So all of our families are from somewhere else. And when our families came to this land, they brought their vines, if they harvest grapes, they brought all kinds of things with them. It's the same story. So if I can tell that story and my story, and you can tell your story, we really start to find out that we have a lot in common. We're more alike than we are unalike. Our stories are the same. We do the same thing when we get around food. We tell stories of the old days. We celebrate times with our families. It's the same story. Anything else?
Any of you have questions? Any of you?
You make me want to go get a degree again. I could listen to you talk all day. Listen, thank you so much for spending the time with us. So incredibly fascinating and profound. I mean, there's a lot of really amazing takeaways from there. You know, it's really especially neat about the canned carrots example. I don't know that I ever thought that through. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. I'm like, oh man, the food drives and stuff warm the cockles of my heart. But then you realize, like, no, that's not reasonable. You're just emptying out your cupboards and giving people what you don't want. And yeah, you're right. There's something that's not right about them.
Yeah, and the other thing that made me change that is one day I participated in it as well, and I was walking. And I was in Kent, and this man was working on this house. He was restoring it. It was really nice. And I'm looking up, and he's telling me, well, why don't you want to come in and take a look? And for a moment, I thought about doing that. And then I realized that I was putting students in danger by collecting canned goods in the community, because what if somebody went into a house like I almost did, and we never saw him again? And so that was another reason I had to stop, because I can't, unless we did it where we would put tags on their doors and we would grab it off the porch. But eventually that just didn't seem feasible, because if one young woman or one man went missing because of a drive that I created, then I wouldn't be able to live with myself. So we just went to food cards because it just made more sense.
Sure, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really good talk. You could come over and up some coffee, and we could talk all night, quite frankly. I'm incredibly fascinated with the intertwining of food and culture, and always have been. And I feel your talk was incredibly enriching. So again, thank you so much.
Yes, you're welcome. And there's a book called In the Shadow of Slavery, Africa's Botanical Legacy in the New World by Judith Kearney, and she tracks that history, and she's a geologist. She tracks that history with her work of Africans migrating, forcefully being migrated. And then she wrote a book called Black Rice, and it's about the fact that this is why I say forcefully migrated for their skilled labor. Africans who were situated in the Salt Sea Islands in Georgia, they were migrated or kidnapped from Africa and migrated for their ability to cultivate rice and indigo. Those were skills they had. The planter class had no skills. The planter class, the only farming skills that they actually end up having was because indigenous, aboriginal, First Nations people taught them those skills. They didn't come with them. They were running because of persecution from England, and they weren't farmers. So when they
No, they
come,
were bankers and lawyers and things.
yeah. So
Yeah.
when they come here as the indigenous people who are going to teach them how to clear land, how to plant farms, etc. And then when they start in the business of trafficking of human beings, they're going to pick Africans with skills and situate them in various locations. So rice cultivation. So I went into the oldest museum in South Carolina. The oldest museum in the United States is in South Carolina this past break. And it was very challenging to get through this museum because the first two panels was indigenous people from that area. And it said that they had been there over 15,000 years, but it only had two windows talking about their history, some pottery, and arrowheads. So the arrowheads say to me, these are really violent people. Look at all these arrowheads, right? And then some broken pottery.
Propaganda.
Right. And then the next, I go a little further, and there's a few pieces about African Americans in the institution of slavery, and it's the ricers. And they're playing a song in the background in this exhibit as if they're so happy to be away from their homelands to harvest rice for Europeans, right? And then the whole rest of this museum is really white supremacy. Look at us. We are the survivors. We did all the work. This is our land. This is the oldest museum in the United States. And I'm telling you, it was
Still acting
horrific.
like it.
It was horrific to go through this museum. And so I want us, if we're going to tell the story about indigenous, aboriginal, First Nations people, half of that museum should be about them.
At least.
A good another section should be about Africans and what they brought to this culture. And then collectively, what three groups of people were able to build that we call America. And then bring in our Latinx community and their contributions, and our Asian communities and we would have no railroads in this country if not for the Chinese, who we said could not bring a relative here for 8 decades by law. 8 decades. The Chinese Exclusion Act. Everybody else could bring their relatives, not them. So there's so much we can learn when we start to think about and talk about food.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else?
Anybody else have questions? Ryan, Kira, Claire, any of you?
Yeah, I'll ask a quick question. So, for those of us, well, okay, first of all, just let me say this has been fascinating. I absolutely loved all of it.
Thank you.
I'm incredibly uneducated on all of this, which is really sad. But I think it's fascinating, and there's a lot to learn. But I was just wondering, for those of us who wanted to kind of like explore these cultures, cuisines, and stuff, and learn more about them, do you have any more resources, books, or websites, or anything that you'd recommend us check out?
Yeah, I will. And what I'll do is I'll send Mackenzie an email and I'll put a ton of links and books and stuff on there for you, so that you can, and because that's what I do for my students. There are a lot of good TED Talks on food now. There's a lot on foraging. Whenever Sean Sherman goes out, say, and I'm going to try and get him to Kent next year when we are back on campus. What he would do is he would walk the grounds of Kent State and he would pick up food. And so when he do his lecture, he would feed you indigenous food and the stuff that he just got up off the land. And he said, we just need to get that word food desert out of our vocabulary. There is enough food to feed everyone. You know that, right? So how do we distribute it in a way that everybody gets to eat? Because right now we throw away twice the amount of food we need to feed people. We're not doing it adequately. President Obama said that we were going to end childhood hunger by 2015. We've increased childhood hunger in this country. So it was when he was in administration, it was 1 out of 5 children went to bed hungry or food insecure. Today it's 1 in 4. So we haven't gotten better. We still have a society that think it's okay for kids to be hungry. For the first time in the history of this country, because of the pandemic, we had free breakfast and lunch for every kid. Why did a pandemic cause us to think that way? It's really sad. As one of the wealthiest countries in the world, that is just extremely sad. So I will be happy to give you some materials to look at.
Yeah, this is the group that I actually utilize in my area. We're all pretty interested in food.
Okay.
We will chase those links and we will anticipate them coming. So I'm going to hold you to that.
Okay, you got it. You got it.
Great.
Okay. Oh, let me just tell you what my menu is this evening.
Yeah.
So I made 3-corn cornbread, blue corn, yellow corn, and whole corn. And then I made some corn. And I always use, I'm vegan, so I didn't put any animal byproducts in any of the food. What else? Oh, I made the wild rice pilaf. And it's a cold dish with pumpkin seeds figure in lots of indigenous foods. Pine nuts and sunflower seeds is another one that figures heavily in the food. So it has wild mushrooms, pumpkin seeds, and cranberries. And this wild rice from White Earth Reservation, it smells muddy. It actually smells like the lake. So if your wild rice does not smell like a lake when you cook it, it is not wild rice.
So what time is dinner again?
Pardon me?
What time is dinner again?
As soon as I'm done. And the other thing, if these are the only folks, the White Earth Reservation and the indigenous people of Hawaii are the only 2 groups that fought Monsanto when they were an entity and won. They're the only 2 groups that beat them. Monsanto wanted to take the taro plant and make it in the laboratory because they claim they're going to feed all these people. And they were losing the battle. The University of Hawaii was letting it happen. And the indigenous people of Hawaii put on their traditional clothes. They start playing their traditional instruments and they marched on the university. And when they finished, the university tore up the document and said it will never, ever happen. Because in their creation story, the taro plant is their brother. Their creator had 2 children, 2 boys, and 1 died, and she buried it. And where she buried it, the taro plant grew, and that's Kalo. That is the brother of the Hawaiian people. Okay, so it's a similar story as the Haudenosaunee with Sky Woman. Sky Woman loses one of her babies too. But there are creation stories that are just so beautiful that really takes you back to the land. Now think about our creation story, those of us who are Christians. Our creation story, when this woman lovingly shares some food with this man, because it's the tree of knowledge, they're expelled. Their creation story, you're not expelled. Think about that. Huh. So, yeah. Okay. Anything else?
Anybody
I
else
do have a
any
question
questions?
if you have time.
Yes.
My name's Kira. Earlier you said that food brings people together, which I totally agree with. I'm just curious if that talking about indigenous food via food, or sorry, that didn't really make sense. If it's been kind of a convincing method for you to talk about food and educating others about indigenous culture, has that been a more helpful way of opening the minds of those who are more resistant?
Yes, and I'll put this last thing in the chat for you because in the Haudenosaunee Nation, there's this Thanksgiving address. And in the Thanksgiving address is done at the beginning of every event. And it's quite long. I was the keynote speaker for Earth Day, and I ended it with the Thanksgiving address, the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address. When we understand people and food, that's all of us. We can't survive without eating, right? If we have any ailments, most of them are food related. So if it's diabetes, if it's heart disease, if you the doctor find that you have a cancer, for example, oftentimes after they get your immune system back working, they will put you on a plant-based diet. We know that we shouldn't eat any cold cuts really because they are full of carcinogens. And there are carcinogens all around us. Pesticides. We can talk about Latinx community in America by looking at pesticides. DDT, for example, was put in on the plants, and Latinx people were actually in the fields with their children, and that DDT was dropped, and nothing changed until white women started having children with limb deficiencies. We didn't get rid of that pesticide until then, because those moms came out and said, you know, I have a baby and my baby has no legs or no feet, or his or her arm is smaller. So then we start to look. But indigenous and Latinx people were already telling us the problems they were having when they gave birth because they were in the fields when this stuff was dropped. There are some chemicals that we still allow in fields today that after the chemical is placed on the plants, you can't go back on that field for 5 days. Why are we eating that? So there's a way to talk about immigration by talking about food. And I could talk about the Latinx community with that, and indigenous workers, the farm workers, the fact that a farm union sprung up because they said enough is enough. And some of us said, okay, we're going to boycott grapes, we're going to boycott lettuce, and we're going to push farm growers in California to work with these folks. This is the same thing that happened when you think about the civil rights, the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. 10 cent a ride. 10 cent a ride. African Americans, people who stood with them, crippled economically the bus system. Crippled, and not only did they cripple it economically, they had to work together. So there were people making lunch for people who were walking because they weren't riding a bus. And they as Black people, they couldn't go into a restaurant anywhere and get any food along the way because they weren't allowed. because of the Jim Crow laws. And outside the Jim Crow laws, if I just didn't want to serve you, I didn't have to. And so that movement, and when we look at the immigration movement or the movement of farm workers with our Latinx community and our indigenous community, those folks really showed us the way. Those were two people-funded organizations that crippled a community that had the power and upper hand. So yeah, we could talk about food and talk about those things. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
You're welcome. There's a text by Frederick Douglass Opie. I don't remember if I put that in there, but it's called Feeding the Revolution, Civil Rights and something. I will add that one to the link, and I will add the cookbooks I use when I'm cooking, when I make a email to Mackenzie so that you all can see that. And by the way, Mackenzie, my quilting is social activist quilting. I do pretty quilts too, but I also do quilts that speak to social activist issues. I made a Black Lives Matters quilt. I made a quilt about trans lives because our trans siblings die in large numbers, especially African American trans folks. We are averaging 30 a year, and oftentimes their lives are not investigated. No one is brought to, there's no justice for them. So I do social activist quilting, along with teaching and cooking.
Really cool.
You are
Yeah.
multifaceted.
Over
I need
interesting.
half your energy, please.
Well,
Must be that
In part-
vegan diet, right?
it's coming to the vegan diet, yeah.
And I'm vegan, yeah.
Diets.
Yeah.
But we are coming to a close. We're only a little bit over 7 o'clock.
Okay.
I have a bunch more questions that I'm probably going to email you about, and hopefully
Please.
get some answers back. If any of you have any questions, we can add that to the email. Just gotta tell me.
And then in the fall of
And I think that was
I'll be happy to do a cooking thing with you all. At the end of the year, when I was on campus, I cooked for my class. My closing event was cooking, and I give them samples of food throughout the semester so that they don't have to change their diet because they take my class. But I do want them to think about, as they matriculate through the university and become adults who are getting a paycheck, because that's primarily why they're here, that they would think about the kind of food that they will start to eat and consume, and treat their bodies with a little bit more respect than they had before. Yeah.
That'd
sure.
be great.
It's definitely really, really cool.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would enjoy that experience. No, I definitely would. So anybody else have anything else to add other than you're really, really, really interesting, and thank you for your time. This was
My
really nice.
pleasure. Thanks
Yeah,
for
this was
having
great.
me. And
Thank
good
you.
luck with all exams, everybody. Thank you.
You got it. Have a
All
great
right.
night, everybody. Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you
Good
so
night.
much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Kenzie, I'll send that to you in the morning, okay?
Okay.
All right.
Well, go
Thanks.
have fun. Go to dinner.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.